Hello everyone, I'm Xavier Sol from Counterbalance. We are a coalition of NGOs working on public finance and especially investments coming from the European Union. And in recent years, with our partners, we tried to explore the new wave of large-scale infrastructure projects being financed all over the world, trying to understand what are the key drivers behind this. And our conclusion is that actually there is a new wave of financialized mega projects, creating important risks, from climate risk to debt burden for emerging economies, for instance. And what I'll do now is quickly to describe some of the main features of this new agenda being built and the challenges linked to it. So basically, since the financial crisis, the consensus has emerged at international level on what we call a global infrastructure agenda, which is really based on the assumption that there is a huge infrastructure gap to be filled. To give you some figures, for example, there is the OECD, so the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, estimating that an additional $70 trillion in infrastructure will be needed by 2030. So governments and financial institutions rely on the role of infrastructure investments as a means to restore economic growth, demand, and jobs in the global economy. So here, infrastructure is really seen as a magic bullet to achieve that. But governments have been often facing a dilemma. How can you finance such infrastructure and boost economic recovery with public resources, while at the same time, many of these governments are meeting the harsh austerity logic and neoliberal dogma that are prevailing nowadays. So, in the hopes of many governments, infrastructure, to overcome that obstacle of the lack of public resources, is to attract a lot of private liquidity and there reduce the financial burden on these constrained public budgets. But to do so, there are different prerequisites. First, the infrastructure projects have to be mega-sized to attract large amounts of capital for a long time. So we're speaking of a different scale of projects. Secondly, the infrastructure needs to be turned into an asset class so that investors, mainly private investors, can look at infrastructure as a pure revenue stream, not as a hospital, school, or bridge, but more as a revenue stream. And the objective is that the financial assets that are being created generate profits when traded on financial markets. That's the second condition. The third one is actually that there is a new wave of privatizations and public-private partnerships, these so-called PPPs, that need to put on the market even more state-owned assets, including infrastructure in the health or education sector, for example. So this vision of infrastructure is now on the top of political agendas at European and international level, especially because to have this happen, you need some public finance to develop the infrastructure. Because these public funds are necessary for infrastructure projects to see the light, but also to de-risk, so to reduce the risk for the private sector and private investors to participate. And the risk here, in our view, is for public money to end up guaranteeing the profits of private investors from revenue streams linked to actually the user fees, for example, paid by citizens. So the logic here is to guarantee a financial extraction of wealth from local communities, ordinary citizens, and territories at the benefit of few domestic and global investors that are simply seeking, high return on their investments. And if something goes wrong, like we saw in many public-private partnerships projects around Europe, for example, ultimately it will be the host governments and the citizens picking up the bill. So there is also a real threat linked to the future debt sustainability here. And a second important element I will try to address now is also something we've been trying to look into in the last 2 years, this is really this concept of infrastructure mega corridors. I mean, infrastructure corridors are not new, but the plans that are now on the drawing boards are actually simply of a massive scale. And this is why we speak of mega corridors of infrastructure. I've got here some maps, and you will see that most, actually all continents are concerned by these mega corridor plans. We see a map of Africa, Latin America, and you will see it's quite interesting to see that many of the routes that are being drawn are actually going very often to the coasts of the different continents, meaning actually it's a lot about exporting natural resources you take from inside the continent to outside. So these master plans, that there are really many, I could have showed many of our maps also at, let's say, sub-regional level or country level. They are actually about to reconfigure continents into, there are a lot of buzzwords, but production and distribution hubs, development corridors, special economic zones, interconnectors, etc. And they are primarily aimed at enhancing export of raw materials and goods and integrating economies in the global markets. And obviously you've heard about this one, the big daddy, let's say, of mega corridors. So the China Belt and Road Initiative, or Silk Road, which is actually largely criticized for its geopolitical implications, certainly for valid reason, but much less for the concept of physical or financial extraction, which is behind it. In our view, this agenda of pushing mega corridors is actually an attempt to revamp economic globalization. And the risk for us is that ultimately it will scale up an already failing development model, which could be locked in for decades to come. The gigantic scale of the infrastructure proposed here will actually profoundly transform and redesign territories, regions, and economies, and consequently the life of billions of people. And for promoters of this model, clearly the human rights impacts of infrastructure projects, for example, is largely ignored. Not to talk about devastating climate impacts that can be linked to it, because when you look into the mega corridors, many of them actually are based on high carbon transport infrastructure. It's all about airports, motorways, and the same on the energy front. It relies a lot on fossil fuels still. So in the end, this infrastructure agenda that is promoted by international institutions actually does not really fit with decarbonization targets, for example, or with the goal to align financial flows with the objectives of the Paris Agreement. Then the question is what to do as activists, as civil society on those important issues. I mean, at the end of the day, the scale of these upcoming issues make it pretty hard for civil society and also critical decision makers to grasp this new agenda and find ways to challenge it. There are different difficulties. One, for example, being, how can you criticize an infrastructure-related agenda in countries where the basic needs of the population are not met, and where those needs could be actually well served by public services and well-tailored infrastructure. Another one is, how can you challenge the growing involvement of the private and financial sector when actually in many countries, the public sector has itself, for a wide set of reasons, has itself failed to deliver on basic infrastructure. There are some difficulties there that could be overcome in our view, but that need to be kept in mind. But in parallel to us, I mean, the multitude of impacts of mega infrastructure projects can then go from transparency to corruption, tax evasion linked to the big projects, debt, the deepening of inequalities, human rights or environmental impacts. All these impacts mean that a great diversity of local communities and social movements will inevitably face these challenges raised by this agenda in the coming years, in the coming decades. So what is at stake here is really for citizens, communities, and social movements to reclaim the concept of infrastructure and essential services, and to be able to develop a counter-narrative to the one that is actually pushed at the moment at international level. I will leave you here with these quick thoughts, and I wish you a good meeting, hoping that you will have a fruitful discussion. Bye. Have a nice day.